Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. It's 11 a.m. in London. We are still waiting for a few more participants to join us, so please sit tight and we will begin in a couple of minutes. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Maria Sofia Reiser. I'm a research analyst at RUSI Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, and it is my pleasure to share today's webinar. I am so happy to be joined by Luis Engelese and Edwin Birech from Transparency International Kenya to discuss the recently published mutual evaluation report and what this means in practice. Before getting started, I will go over some housekeeping points and note that the full webinar, including the Q&A section, is being recorded today. If you want to ask a question, please post it in writing in the Q&A box, and please do include your name and organization. If you want to boost your question, and you have already posted, please do make use of the upvote function. Most of you will be familiar with RUSI's Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, but for those of you who are not, we are a specialist research program within RUSI on the intersection of finance and security. We aim for our research to equip the international community with the knowledge, tools, and ideas that they need to be able to understand, identify, but also disrupt the threats of illicit finance. This webinar today is part of our Restricting Kleptocracy project, which is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. As part of this project, we aim to engage with journalists and civil society actors focused on financial crime in East Africa, Latin America, and Western Balkans. And as the project moves forward, we hope to expand beyond these regions. The project focuses on empowering these civil society actors and journalists to hold government institutions, as well as regulated businesses, to account on their roles and responsibilities in tackling domestic financial crime. The FATF has recently published its second mutual evaluation report for Kenya. For those of you joining who are not familiar with the process, mutual evaluations are in-depth country reports analyzing the implementation and effectiveness of measures to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, as well as proliferation financing. These reports are peer reviews where members from different countries assess another country. So in doing so, they provide an in-depth description and analysis of how the country's framework is doing in preventing abuse of the financial system, as well as providing priority actions and recommendations for the country. Mutual evaluations are made up of two components, effectiveness and technical compliance. And most countries tend to do really well in complying with the 40 FATF recommendations. But where the struggle lies is to demonstrate the effectiveness of anti-financial crime frameworks. And you may ask, how is a mutual evaluation report relevant to civil society and the media in a country? Well, these evaluations are useful tools for non-government actors that are advocating for transparency and progress in the fight against financial crime and kleptocracy in their home countries. An empowered civil society and media community can help monitor what is expected of a country in complying with its international obligations. And this allows kleptocratic leaders to be accountable for their actions. To do this effectively, civil society needs the knowledge that will enable them to hold this corrupt activity to account. They need to understand laws and regulations that should be applied to restrict and prosecute this corrupt activity. They need to understand the policy accountability chain, which includes the responsible local government bodies up to international standard setters. They need to be aware of these international agreed standards and what their country should be doing to tackle illicit finance. And they should be aware of the responsibilities placed not only on the government, but on private sector actors, whose skills and services can be abused by the corrupt to move this money out of the home countries and into the financial system, where we know it's really easy to hide and really hard to find. Our discussion today will aim to highlight the key findings and priority actions that the FATF has identified and determined for Kenya. And it will include on-the-ground opinions on what this means in practice for the country. As ever, we welcome your thoughts, comments, questions as participants in today's webinar. So please do make good use of our Q&A box and the upvote function I mentioned. I will do my best to cover as much of your input as possible. And with that all said, I will now pass the floor to Luis and Edwin, who have been working on the ground looking at Kenya's assessment of money laundering and terrorist financing risks and the overall effectiveness of this framework. Luis, Edwin, the floor is all yours. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Rosie. Good evening from Kenya. Good morning in London. So my name is Edwin Bidej. I work at Transparency International Kenya as a project officer under the social justice and economic accountability pillar. So perhaps maybe before I call my colleague Lewis, or just to give a brief bio about Transparency International Kenya. And Transparency International Kenya is a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 1999 with the aim of developing a transparent and corrupt-free society. So our signature approach is we try to do this through promoting good governance and social justice aspects of it. So TI Kenya, as I would perhaps maybe refer often, is one of the autonomous chapters of the Global Transparency International movement, but that is again bound by a common vision of a corruption-free free world. So yeah, TI Kenya has 20 years experience in governance, work at the national level, and also at the county level, besides working in selected countries within the East Africa region on various projects that we do implement. My colleague Lewis and I work in the social and economic accountability pillar. And this pillar looks at the aspect of economic transparency and accountability, which are key aspects and tenets of having democratic good governance. So over to you, Lewis.
Hello, good morning for those in London, Europe. Good afternoon for those in Kenya. I am Luis Ngelese. I am the project officer, the public finance management, previously social justice and economic accountability at Transparency International Kenya. Welcome and hoping to engage with all of you. Thank you.
So thanks, Lewis. Thanks, Ruzi. So this webinar has actually been divided into two sections. One is on mutual evaluation, and the other one is on the national risk assessment. So I think I'll go first, and I'll invite everyone to just go with me as we undertake this activity. So I'll be speaking on the the NRA bit of it. So this aspect looks at the risk assessment implements the recommendations one of the International Financial Action Task Force, and this specifically aims at identifying, among other things, analyzing and evaluating the threats of money laundering and terrorist financing, ideally how these criminal activities are carried out, the vulnerabilities of the national systems in place to prevent, investigative, and combat this phenomenon. And it looks at the sectors that are most exposed to these risks. So the purpose of the risk assessment is actually to draw up courses of action to mitigate identified risks, and to adopt a risk-based approach to anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism activities. The purpose of this risk assessment, like I mentioned, is to draw up the courses of action to mitigate these aspects. The results of the NRA processes are critical in the sense that they help towards the development of the country's national anti-money laundering and countering terrorism strategy, which are informed basically by the risks that are identified to allow for effective allocation of the country's resources in order to mitigate the identified money laundering terrorism finance risk to the country. Just to give us a brief background on this, the money laundering terrorism financing NRA for Kenya was carried out by the task force gazetted in 2019 through a consultative process aligned to international anti-money laundering and the aspect of combating financing of terrorism standards involving both the public and the private sectors. So thanks. I think we're in the second slide. Yes, thanks. So just to speak about that is, I was just giving a brief background on the same. So an analysis of the NRA is indicative of a robust AML, CFT, legal, and institutional framework. So money laundering remains one of the key concerns, and most importantly, it is actually a significant area for Kenya because it facilitates and conceals crime that can actually distort, financial systems in Kenya. So for Kenya, it is particularly Kenya is actually particularly vulnerable to all forms of illicit financial flaws because of a number of issues. In looking at the process, I think next, please. Thank you. In looking at the process of this financial, the NRA, the NRA is actually exercised. It's actually, it actually uses a synopsis that was conducted in 2020 using the World Bank's NRA tool to assess. So this is actually the methodology that was adopted. And perhaps for this, the report guides the country in identifying the gaps that are available or that are present, as well as giving a raft of frameworks that an idea of a raft of frameworks that have been put in place. So in identifying the gaps and deficiencies in AML and CFT frameworks, it also prepares for it also prepares the country to meet the FATF standards. These are the Financial Action Task Force standards that have been put in place. And this is in line with the second round of the mutual evaluation that actually looks into the level of understanding of money laundering and terrorist financing, and looks at the risks as well as other aspects whereby the application of risks are actually measured. So the process generally is a process whereby the NRA exercises involves a task force that was composed, like I mentioned before, and it is actually composed of almost 30 public sector organizations that are actually engaged in this process. But basically, what needs to be noted is that for these public sector organizations, they actually engage in national efforts to combat money laundering and terrorism financing. So key to it is the relevant ministries within the government. Also, there are agencies within the ministries. This includes even the financial sector, supervisors, prosecutional, and investigative agencies. But also to notice that it has around 140 public and private sector nominees who participated in the NRS exercise, and out of which nearly 70 participants represents the private sector. In terms of the methodology, the assessment looks into a number of aspects. First of all, it looks at issues to do with tax crime vulnerability. It looks at issues to do with security sector vulnerabilities, the banking sectors, other financial institutions, the non-financial businesses and persons. Normally we call them the DNF BPS. It looks also at the aspect of environmental crimes vulnerability, among other aspects. Next. Yeah, so this is where I was. So the methodology of this NRA assessment looks at the various aspects that I've listed before. Like I mentioned before, this the issue of the banking sector. It looks at the banking sector. It looks at the security sector, insurance sector, and also other financial aspects of it, environmental crimes vulnerability, as well as the not-for-profit organization. Next slide. Yeah, so the overall money laundering threats are that it was actually assessed as a medium which is potential for an increase in the future. And to talk to that is that the banking sector, which is one of the critical sectors that plays a very enormous role in preventing money laundering, was actually assessed as the sector with the highest impact of the country's money laundering. So this is largely due to it being the central role of and playing the central role of commercial banks within the economy. And for Kenya, it's within the Central Bank of Kenya. Secondly, it looks at the real estate because this is where where money remittance providers are domiciled. It looks at the legal professionals because the legal professionals are also placed in as reporting institutions. It looks at the SACCOs and the second-hand motor vehicle industry. So these are more or less what you call the car yards in Kenya. So the outlined sectors have rather relatively weaker frameworks on money laundering and terrorism financing oversight. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the predominant and predicate offenses that are available, of course, are issues to do with the fraud and forgery. We look at the aspect of corruption. And in corruption, we look at all the various forms of corruption, but basically this is the aspect, it looks at more or less at the aspect of grand corruption, because the grand corruption basically is more wider than the petty corruption. It looks at the aspect of drug trafficking. It also looks at the aspect of environmental crimes, as well as the aspect of the tax evasion. Next slide. So in looking at the aspect of the investigations, the assessment that was conducted revealed that the number of money laundering investigations in the country are still low, because there's still relatively a large number of allegations that have been reported. Then most of the investigations and prosecutions are conducted without considering, the parallel financial investigations alongside predicate offenses. So this includes the ability to pursue such things, including confiscation of property, as well as corresponding value as appropriate. So looking at that aspect, in my next slide, I'm going to give the statistics. So the assessment found out that data management systems are employed by various ministries, as well as departments and agencies within these ministries generally do not facilitate ease of access and use of collected information. It was also noted that some organizations actually use different formats. And what I mean by formats are basically, the categorizations and classifications of pieces of information. So besides that, there was the aspect of, the information is not stored at all. And I think this is a challenge based on what the findings revealed from this particular activity. In looking at the NPO sector, and I think this is actually on my next slide, the reports indicate that the non-profit organizations in Kenya are registered under different laws. But basically, this is within the National Governmental Organization Coordination Act, whereby also again you realize that the Companies Act, the Societies Act, the Trustees, this sense the Perpetual Succession Act, registers non-profit organizations differently. In some cases, other non-profit organizations are actually created, as informal associations, whereby they are registered under the Department of Gender and Social Services. So in such a way, this is ideally set in such a way that it's meant for the pursuit of other legally benevolent purposes. So what happens is that the board, the NGOs board, for it to be effective and to monitor effectively, as well as supervise and perform other regulatory obligations with reporting requirements under the Proceeds of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Act, there's need to enhance the task, the terrorist financing risk factor for activities conducted by the NPOs in the country. The gaps that were revealed in the NRA, and that would be in my next slide, are that there's the aspect, the next slide, please. Yes, I'll be going to talk, I'll just talk about the gaps in the NRA. What was revealed in the NRA was that a number of issues emerged. First of all, the consistency of information and the risk profile. In this case, the statistics on corruption cases reported and value of process do not match the categorization of the risk, which is put in as moderate. Then again, the not-for-profit, the NPOs involved in governance were not involved in the process. And I think this is actually where the gap is. And of course, a review of the stakeholders involved in the process and the criteria for selection, particularly among the private sector players, and whether or not the views of the selected stakeholders was a collective response, is something that these players also play a very critical role. So mostly, not all of them are actually involved in this aspect of it. The other bit was the lack of records, and as well as the information, which are very key and superficial, with little to no in-depth analysis on the linkages. Besides the national risk profile of Kenya, in this case, it relates to the money laundering threats, which is really, as portrayed in the report, is not supported by the records and statistics that are presented but mostly and more often by authorities. So this NRA report gave a raft of recommendations, and I think I'll be able to talk that in the next slide. Yeah, so next slide again. The raft of recommendations basically are on one, on policy and legal frameworks, whereby the assessment established that LEAs actually do not identify money laundering cases arising from terrorist predicates. So again, related to the policy and legal, whereby the assessment proposes that the legal reform should enable the Financial Reporting Center to actually temporarily freeze or detain any suspicious transactions that are brought to its table. So again, it is actually recommended that the layers actually adopt a policy to investigate, the money laundering aspect of it and the components for all the offenses that are related to terrorism. The other bit of the second bit of the recommendation, and that would be my second slide. And the next slide would be the operational and the domestic operations, the domestic corporations, whereby the segregated nature, the nature in which the current data is stored, ideally makes it a bit difficult to effectively do an analysis regarding, the use of the available information. So, in a nutshell, it's actually segregated in nature. So, and the data makes it. The current data is actually stored in such a way that it makes it difficult to effectively analyze and use the available information. The second aspect would relate to the digitizations of data. So one of the key things is that data digitization is actually recommended, and I mean this is key if we are yet to realize, and facilitate an update of withdrawal and addition of charges in the judiciary, and as a mechanism to actually make a shift from the current format to drafting, charges related to money laundering. And basically, in a scenario whereby the focus is on the number of charges as opposed to the nature of charges. So that was another key focus that came out under the operation and domestic cooperation. The third aspect relates to the coordination between interagencies, and by this I mean situations whereby the government needs to strengthen, the interagency coordination mechanism, such as having joint investigative teams between institutions in the government, for instance, the Kenya Revenue Authority, the asset recovery agencies, the JTAG, and the EACC, the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. So all this actually aimed at enabling these institutions to follow the money laundering offenses through the use of a wide range of financial intelligence and other information. So this was the three were among key recommendations that are highlighted based on the operation and domestic corporations on it. My third recommendation would be basically on resource and capacity building, and I think that is on the next slide. If you may go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So basically that would relate to the resources and capacity building aspects, whereby if there's need to be an effective pursuing, then of course the government should actually enhance the capacity of the asset recovery agencies, the ACA, and the Financial Reporting Center to be able to effectively undertake their mandate to pursue the proceeds and instrumental list of crime. So by this I mean supporting these very critical agencies in terms of with the resources, basically financial and both capacity and the technical capacity to enable them function effectively. The other aspect was that the assessment has clearly revealed that while Kenya is largely capable of pursuing these offenses, there has been limited instances in which the assets and proceeds from these crimes are identified, frozen, and confiscated. The other recommendation would basically be on the regulatory and supervisory aspect, and that is in my next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so basically there's need for having a risk-based approach whereby it is effectively supervised. And with this is that the financial sector and the DNF BPS supervisors should actually implement a risk-based approach and effectively supervise their respective sectors to aid in compliance. So this is very crucial and this is very critical because this is more of an entry point in combating these crimes. So the other aspect would be the need to conduct and continue giving an update generally on the sectors and institutions that are recently assessed to establish the level of risk in various sectors for risk intervention. So these are relating to money laundering and terrorist financed threats in those key sectors. Again, it is proposed that the Law Society of Kenya should actually be designated as supervisor in respect of the legal profession. And this actually was captured in the recently enacted the Proceeds of Crime and Money Laundering, whereby the advocates and legal firms were actually put in as reporting institutions in the aspect of as a way of combating, the terrorist financing. But again, I think there's a challenge with this because the lawyers actually went to court, and this process is actually in court at the moment. Just to wind up my presentation in terms of conclusions, of course, having done the research on the NPOs, but the non-for-profit, and that is in my last slide. If you may just click on the next slide. Yes, that one. So having done a research on NPO participation, the not-for-profit participation in the FATF processes, it seems that the findings of the NRA and the research by Transparency International in Kenya are actually consistent, as they both indicate the lack of proper frameworks for coordination and supervising and supervision that, and it is actually therefore prudent to just continue advocating for the implementation of the Public Benefits Organization Act. Remember, this is an act of parliament that was assented to by the president in 2013, but again, nothing much has been done. And of course, there's been an attempt to actually amend this act of parliament, even without putting it into practice. So lastly, of course, there's need to be more of synergy and linkages. I mean, the working relationship and just building capacity of all actors to just keep, proper records analysis of information to ensure that the assessment is actually accurate and it's factual to facilitate the development of beneficial frameworks to address the risk. So basically, those are my key presentations, basically relating to the NRA summary with key focus on Kenya. So I think at this point, I will invite my colleague Lewis to just take us through the next presentations. And then, of course, we'll pick up from there. Lewis?
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Edwin, for that brief and very comprehensive analysis of the NRA. I'll be taking you shortly through some key findings from the recent mutual evaluation report. Basically, I believe this is an ongoing analysis also on our end, on Bruce's end, and these are some of the findings that we've received and we've analyzed thus far, and we hope to continue with this analysis. But as it is now, I'm going to take you through a couple of things. I'm going to take you through an overview of these. So next slide, please, the first slide after that one. Yeah, basically that's the overview of what I'm going to take you through. So I'm going to take you through the introduction, the background, the progress made post the first mutual evaluation review report, the findings of the second mutual evaluation report, priority actions, and then the conclusions. So basically, just to take you through an introduction is the FATF mutual evaluation report, evaluations, as we all know, are in-depth country reports analyzing the implementation and effectiveness of measures to combat money laundering and terrorism financing. Mutual evaluations are peer reviews where members from different countries assess another country. A mutual evaluation report basically provides an in-depth description and analysis of a country's system for preventing criminal abuse of the financial system, as well as focused recommendations to the country to further strengthen the system. So a background, a basically brief background. Next slide, please. Yeah, next one. Thank you. Yeah, that one. So just to give you a brief background is that Kenya underwent an on-site visit as part of the mutual evaluation process, which took place from 31st of January to I think around 11th February 2022. Since then, the SMLAG, the Eastern Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group, has since completed its assessment of Kenya's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist and proliferation financing system. And so we have the mutual evaluation report of Kenya, which comprehensively reviews the effectiveness of Kenya's measures and its level of compliance with the FATF recommendations. Recently, I think in September, towards the end of August and towards September, the Council of Ministers of SMLAG adopted this report at its meeting in Livingstone, Zambia in September 2022. But before we go into the findings of the report and recommended actions from the report, I would like to basically just take you back to the first mutual evaluation report and some key developments that were acknowledged by this report since the first mutual evaluation took place were that there has been efforts to enhance the National Task Force on AML and CFT, whose objectives include developing a national policy framework on AML and CFT and the revision of existing legislations, as well as the Kenyan government making appropriate recommendations to the Attorney General for strengthening it. Secondly, there's been the fact that Kenya has frequently amended the POCAMLA and introduced POCAMLA regulation to address most of the weaknesses identified in the 2010 mutual evaluation report. And also to take into account the requirements of the revised FATF standards, which were introduced in 2012. So the most recent amendment was done in 2021. I think Edwin has mentioned that designated lawyers in insurance intermediaries as reporting institutions. However, at the end of the on-site visit, the implementation of the amended POCAMLA provisions in relation to lawyers as reporting institutions and Law Society of Kenya's supervisory authority had been suspended pending High Court determination. The other development over time from 2010, the report in 2010, has been the enactment of POTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, in 2012, which criminalizes terrorism financing, and POTA regulations in 2013, which provide for implementation of the terrorism financing service to implement the freezing and confiscation of terrorist funds and assets. There's also been the establishment of Assets and Recovery Agency, the ARA, to implement provisional measures and confiscation of proceeds of crime. Fourthly, is the establishment of the MAT, the multi-agency team to fight corruption and other serious crime. So related to this is the development of the National Anti-Corruption Plan for 2015-2019, and launched by the National Ethics and Anti-Corruption Policy Paper number 2 of 2018, which provides for a comprehensive framework for the design and development of an effective legal and institutional framework for fighting corruption and promoting ethics and integrity. As we all know, and as Edwin has mentioned, is that corruption, although not covered by the NRA, and its risk profiling was, I think, moderate. So, but albeit the moderate profiling, you'd notice that statistically, corruption is one of the high process-generating predicate crimes, and as much as it was identified in the NRA, I think its proper positioning and categorization was a problem, and I think Edwin has mentioned that in the analysis is given and on the gaps. So the other progress that has been made was demonetization of the old shilling 1,000 notes in 2019, the old currency. In 2019, whose objective was to, amongst other deals, deal conclusively with emerging concerns about illicit financial flows and counterfeits. Lastly, on the progress made was the creation of a specialized division in the audit intended to identify risks associated with AML, the money laundering, AML, and terrorism financing. The divisions are the Anti-Corruption Division, the Transnational Organized Crime Division, the Counterterrorism Division, and the Process of Crime Recovery Unit. So basically, you can see with that analysis, you can see, and with that finding of the current report, you can see some progress over time made by the government of Kenya in adoption of key institutional and legislative frameworks to just sort of combat money laundering and terrorism financing. So I'm going to go directly into the findings of the report. Could you please move on to the next slide, kindly? Next, like 3 slides down, sorry. I might have moved a bit fast. So yeah, so Some key findings of the report is what I've mentioned, that the fact that the ML and CFT legal institution frameworks have improved since 2011. And notably, you can see that the Asset Recovery Agency was established. There was enhancing of the human and technical resources for the Financial Reporting Center. There was conducting of the National Risk Assessment on money laundering and terrorism financing. There was also a raft of regulations and amendments to beneficial ownership transparency, to comply with international standards on AML and CFT, and to address the deficiencies identified in the mutual evaluation report done in 2011. But despite this progress, there's clearly still some gaps in compliance and generally what Maria initially mentioned, effectiveness. So which need to actually get addressed, and I believe will get addressed in the next period of in the next probably 10 years and before the post mutual evaluation report review. So secondly, on the findings of the report, it is noted that Kenya carried out its NRA exercise from 2019 to 2021. In addition to that is that the FRC, the Financial Reporting Center, and Financial Sector Supervisory Body also conducted sectoral risk assessments. However, the findings of this NRA highlight key weaknesses in Kenyans' understanding of the risk, related but not limited to different types of AML, cash, and cross-border risks, types of legal persons, terrorism financing, politically exposed persons, non-profit organizations, not-for-profit organizations, as well as the virtual assets and the service providers. As you would note, and I think this is something that Edwin has mentioned in his analysis of the NRA, is that this insufficient evidence to conclude that the understanding of the risk of risks is adequate to inform the Kenya National AML and CFT strategy, and whether findings of the NRA have been effectively cascaded to the financial institutions and designated non-financial business professions. Furthermore, Kenya did not demonstrate the national AML CFT strategy adequately addresses the identified risks. Something worth noting around, probably around NRA, is this was made public, I think, post the on-site visit, as opposed to, I think, ideally that would have been made public before then. I'm not certain about why that was made public most recently. I think if it was not July, if I'm not wrong, it's August. And basically, I think Edwin noted this in his discussion, was that the involvement of the NPO sector, particularly governance, non-profit organization engaged in governance work was evident, and therefore I think there's need to further interrogate the process, particularly the NRA, the involvement of the key stakeholders, and just generally what the process was meant to achieve at large, because I believe it did a good job at sort of profiling the risks, concerns around just corruption and how it was placed at a moderate level, as opposed to yet the data shows that clearly that it's a leading predicate offense. The other key finding from this mutual evaluation report was that while Kenya has powers in place, it does not have demonstrable strategic policy to prioritize investigation and prosecution of money laundering cases. And it should be noted that most of the cases that prosecuted are corruption cases, and it's only when the suspicious activities around money laundering do the agencies with the mandate to do so check up the matter and investigate it. So that is the other concern that was raised by this report. So just to go on with this, is that the authorities prioritize predicate offenses such as corruption over ML, I think I've mentioned that, and do not carry out to a wider extent parallel investigations alongside predicate offenses investigations, resulting in money laundering investigation and no successful prosecutions. I think this has been attributed by the report to the poor understanding of the ML risks, the lack of collecting statistics on different ML types, and the prioritization of the prosecution of predicate offenses, especially corruption over ML, which has limited Kenya's ability to effectively investigate and prosecute money laundering cases in line with its high risk profile. So something notable again about that particular point is the fact that Clearly, if you look at the NRA and even among its recommendations, it speaks out to a need to actually have an proper recording of data among law enforcement agencies, the LIAs, and ultimately all the agencies involved in prosecution, investigation of these predicate offenses. Something interesting is even the NRA notes that there's very little data, and there's need to further consolidate these data and bring them together to actually get proper information to enable the furtherance of AML and CFT frameworks. The other finding was Kenya has not investigated or prosecuted legal or natural persons for terrorist financing offenses in line with its risk profile. The lack of convictions resulting from a large number of parallel terrorism financing investigations suggests that improvements are required in the ability to investigate and prosecute terrorism financing. Terrorist financing is not integrated as a component of the wide-ranging efforts to tackle the severe and fatal terrorist risks suffered by Kenya, and that there are no strategic safety policies or strategies to counter the threat. So something else that the report had was Kenya has legislative gaps in preventing it from providing domestic effect to the United Nations Security Council resolutions, that is resolutions 1267, 1989, and 1988, as they were not issued consistent with the statutory comments of Porter. Something else is, and I think this is something as TI and I think Rusi and also covers, is Kenya has a large NPO sector, and quite notably is the fact that the sector is unregulated and unsupervised, and with that, the sector cannot be assessed effectively for its terrorism financing risk, and the high-risk subset of the organizations likely to be at risk of terrorism financing abuse has not been identified. And I think something to note with that is there hasn't been a sector risk assessment, and in the approach of this, there's not been evidence of a risk-based approach as recommended by the FATF standards. So something else is also the number of cases detected pertaining to declaration of cross-border movement of currencies, and bearer negotiated instruments, only 2 in 5-year period. The VP is not consistent with risk profile. That is also something that we noted, and is a finding in that report. The other key findings, which include information that I've initially tackled, the patterns of information, the lack of information therein. But something else that is worth noting, and it's a development in Kenya, would be that Kenya has not carried out a risk assessment to identify and understand ML, money laundering and terrorism financing risk associated with or emerging from virtual assets and virtual asset service providers such as VAs and VSPs. So basically, I would go back now to some recommended actions, and I think Maria Sophie will cover much of them, but I'll just point at a few of them, and that's basically to review the legal framework in relation to preventive measures applicable to targeted financial sanctions in relation to terrorism financing and proliferation financing, and ensure that subsidiary instruments are based on the primary legislation that they are issued with. And then the other point is the fact that, and I think I've mentioned this previously, is there's a need to actually prioritize ML investigation and prosecution alongside associated predicate offenses like corruption. There's also some other item on the implementation of measures to put in place to curb cross-border transportation of cash above the and bearer and negotiated instruments above the threshold without declaring or misdeclaring should be strengthened to match the geopolitical and economic profile of the jurisdiction. Some of these key recommendations also include, for instance, the authorities should also continue to build on their understanding of capacity building, as Edwin had mentioned in the NRA. Some of the findings of the NRA that authorities should continue to build their understanding on money laundering and terrorism financing risk by carrying out a more thorough assessment of money laundering risks informed by more in-depth analysis of the activities generating highest value proceeds and specific to Kenya's changing economic context. I think I'd be, with the time constraints, I'll probably end there and ask Maria Sophie to come in and complete this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louis, and thank you, Edwin, as well, for these insightful remarks and an analysis of how Kenya has identified its risks of money laundering and terrorist financing, but also how the assessors have have identified this risk as well, and whether this is aligned or not. I just want to give a brief overview in the interest of not repeating the same findings or the same recommendations of some priority actions that I think are relevant to bring up. So the FATF has outlined several priority actions, as Luis has gone over now. And I think the main recommendation we can take out for this is that authorities should continue to build their understanding of risks, because without understanding the risk, they cannot effectively implement the risk-based approach FATF expects, but they can also not manage their anti-financial crime frameworks correctly and the risk the country has to face. Not only does Kenya have to look at money laundering risk, but also what are the actual activities generating the highest value of proceeds of crime. I would like to focus these priority actions as well on two of the FATF priorities for their strategic activities, which are asset recovery and beneficial ownership transparency. I'm not going to go over all the key findings. Also, in the interest of time, I would like to answer some of the questions. But in the case of BO transparency, we see that the assessment team has identified, as well as the NRA, two main types of legal persons in Kenya, which are companies and limited liability partnerships. What we see here is that companies have been much more regulated, and now information about the types, the formation, their basic regulation, their laws, and process for compliance are available to the public through the business registration services and their website. But this BO information is limited only to competent authorities. So reporting entities are not really permitted to access this information to be able to verify their customer due diligence independently and see if the information submitted by their clients or potential clients is accurate. So I think this is one key area to focus on when we're looking at the availability of beneficial ownership information. And from the report, we can really see that the assessment team could not really determine the effectiveness of any sanctions for not providing this beneficial ownership information, because no entity has been sanctioned in Kenya for non-compliance with information requirements. So we can't really see how the country is regulating this. And I would like to highlight the main recommendation in this regard. Again, to conduct risk assessments for all the type of legal persons and arrangements that are in place in Kenya, and to understand what the appropriate action is to mitigate any risk identified to each respective legal person. And I think also we need to note in terms of BO information that these obligations should be extended to all legal persons, not only companies, and ensure that important and relevant authorities to this monitoring of information, such as the Ministry of Lands, has the powers to resource and monitor the compliance with these legal arrangements, because it makes there is no use for it to be a requirement if it's not being regulated, the appropriate penalties are not in place, and the law enforcement agencies cannot follow up and monitor the obligations. And then quickly moving on to asset recovery, as both Luis and Edwin mentioned, Kenya pursues confiscation as a policy objective. Now there's an asset recovery agency, and it pursues confiscation of not only proceeds of crime, but instrumentalities of crime, even if not at the same extent. I think here the best recommendation to look at is the fact that there needs to be at least provisional measures to be able to confiscate property of equivalent value, not necessarily the proceeds of a specific crime. I think this is related to both the presentations in terms of the national risk assessment, because the risk identified there do not really reflect the risk profile in terms of what is being confiscated by the authorities. I think the asset recovery measures are a good example of this lack of alignment. And Kenya should be prioritizing money laundering as a big threat, not only, as they have stated, as a big risk, not only cases of corruption or theft of public funds, which are actually where the recoveries are coming from. So there needs to be a realignment of what's going on in terms of what they have identified as a risk and what is actually being confiscated. In terms of domestic offenses, that is the focus of confiscations from the report. We can see that process of crime, instrumentalities of crimes in terms of trafficking of drugs or wildlife trophies are much more prevalent than than cases internationally. There have been only, I think, 2 cases recorded of crimes identified and pursued where the benefits and instrumentalities of crime were located outside of the jurisdiction. And I think the main point here is that to comply with FATF recommendations, particularly 4 and 38, which relate to confiscation and mutual legal assistance for asset recovery, we also need to look at the effectiveness of immediate outcome 8, which covers confiscation. And I think the main point here is that financial investigations should actually prioritize the tracing of these proceeds of crime, and parallel investigations should be conducted to be able to determine where these funds went and how to be able to recover them. And beyond that, in terms of all of these processes, and I think it applies to all recommendations, we need to look at identifying what is going on, how it's being monitored, how these assets are being confiscated. We need to have good statistics of what's going on with this, as with all technical compliance with the recommendations. And we need to have good management systems for these funds that are confiscated. And I think that would be a brief summary of the main FATF strategic priorities for this coming year. I just wanted to highlight what is going on with Kenya. And I think in the coming months, we're going to be releasing some more work related to these issues. So we will be discussing this further. I want to cover some questions. We have very little time, but I see Rafael asked if there were any other documents or assessments of what's going on in Kenya and abroad. And I would just like to point out that the Basel Institute of Governance, as well as the Sentry, have done some really good reports on the risks identified in Kenya. So if you want a starting point, it would be great to look at those assessments. And then I will just pass on to Lewis and Edwin to answer Stephen's question, which is what opportunities do we see in the MER for the public sector to rectify these areas of improvement that we have outlined and identified? And what areas would partnership between these sectors, between civil society and the public sector, would be most fruitful? Lewis, Edwin, if you want to cover it. I know we have just a couple of minutes, but I want to cover the discussion.
Maria, if I may go first, I think we've covered much of what needs to be done basically, and from where I sit, I think it should be an initiative of not only the FRC and mandated agencies, but also actors within the private space. The public and private stakeholders should actually come together and sort of build capacity and further and enhance awareness on ML and CFT. But also it's upon, I think, the government to also make sure that we do not only have legislation in place, but we also make them effective. And that's the only way we make them effective is if we actually implement them. I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Lewis. And just to cover a following question, just to close up the couple of minutes, we see that, are there any plans that you know of to develop the risk-based approach to Kenya's regime through public-private information sharing about the typologies, the laundering of process of crime overseas? What I would just note from this is that the FSRB SMLAG is constantly releasing specific typology reports. I am not personally aware of a specific public-private information sharing platform in this moment. I don't know if you are.
I think, as you said, I am aware that they also release typology reports on particular sectors and the risks in those sectors, but I've not had any. I think you're quite right, I think.
Yeah, I was also not aware of anything ongoing at the moment of this information, but I think from what we've seen in these reports and these findings, I think it's very important to share this information, and civil society and the private sector should be very aware of what is going on with these reports. And I think a good place to start is just by understanding what is going on in these reports, so we can find spaces for engagement as civil society members, as well as for the private sector. And just because we're on time, I just wanted to finally ask the final question by Pele, who mentioned that just wanted to know the rating of immediate outcome 6. I see the correction. And actually the effectiveness rating for Kenya is low. If we see that section of supervision and use of investigations, prosecutions, it's quite low. So immediate outcome 6, 7, and 8 usually are assessed together and are located together in the report. And immediate outcome 6, 7 are both low, and 8 confiscation is moderate, which is a bit better because of the improvements that we mentioned in the frameworks, but still there's a long way to go, I think. Well, with that, I think we're in time. I'm sorry to rush through the questions. We will be having this recorded, and so if you want to reach out to us or email us, we are more than happy to keep the discussion going. If you want to know about other events that we're going to be doing, please follow our Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies either on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or sign up to our mailing list. And also make sure you follow Transparency International Kenya to find out about all of the analysis they've been doing on this field. And with that, I just want to thank Luis and Edwin for joining us today, and invite you to just bring up any ending remarks, and just thank you again for such a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Maria, for having us.
Thank you for being here, and I know it's Independence Day, so I wish you all a great day, and thank you for making space in your day for tuning into this discussion. And with that, I think we can call it a day. And if you have any other questions, just you can find my email on the RUSI website, and we'll make sure to clarify any doubts or continue the discussion. Thanks again, and thank you to the RUSI events team for our production. It's been